Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast, interview your ideal clients, and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Category Creation Series on the B2B Growth Show. I'm John Rougeux, your host for today's episode. Now, if you're in the B2B space and haven't used or at least heard of the products that today's guest has helped scale, then you might have been living under a rock. Because joining us today is Mill Macaitis, who's led marketing for some of the greatest B2B SaaS companies of all time, like Slack, Zendesk, and Salesforce. In this interview with Bill, we discuss how branding and an attention to customers has helped category-defining and category-leading companies succeed. Bill has more experience here than most people in software, and I'm sure you'll learn just as much from his thoughts as I did. So without further ado, let's listen in to our interview with Mill Macaitis. Bill, I'm thrilled to have you on the show today. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for the kind words, John. It's an honor to be here.
All right, so we have a lot of potential ground to explore today in terms of category creation. But before we dive in, Bill, could you start us off by telling just a little bit about your background? And in other words, who was Mill Macaitis before he started working with such high-profile brands?
I hate to admit it, but I've always been a little business nerd. I think it was in fourth or fifth grade, I was reading Fortune, Forbes, and Business Week. And I've just always had a passion for business and creating categories and new enterprises. Certainly wasn't doing it at that age, but I always had a passion around that. And I think marketing was kind of the nexus of so many of the different fun elements of running a business. So always was huge into it. I did start up right out of college. Didn't even know VCs then that would actually give you money to run your business. So we did it the old-fashioned way, which was growing a business and an early SaaS subscription model. And this was all the way back in 96. It was a gaming website, and we were able to build 3 tiers of membership, profitable, sold it. Spent about the next 10 years on the B2C side of the business, went through a couple exits, and then the last 10 was on the B2B side. So with the companies you had mentioned, Slack, Salesforce, and Zendesk. And after 20 years of kind of doing those operator roles and being fortunate to be involved in a number of exits, I made a career move and was either going to kind of go down the VC route or the board advisor route. And I chose the latter, and it's really fun. I get to work with other great startups now, and I help them from an advisory perspective with their org design, with marketing tech stacks, with go-to-market strategy. And it still allows me to kind of stay in the game, which I love, but work with a great array of founders.
Good stuff. Well, we're lucky to have so much experience to tap into today. So maybe to start things off, could you share what you've learned about how B2B buyers make purchase decisions? And in particular, what role do you see category playing in that process?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, B2B mimics B2C. It's maybe a little further behind, but I think all of us can relate that how we research and buy products now are a little different than how we did it 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And you see people, at least on the B2B side, definitely researching, educating themselves about the company, the products, the pricing, the solutions. They're doing a lot more research in advance before they talk to sales. If they talk to sales, right? They're relying much more on peer recommendations. They're using sites like a Trust Radius that just does, B2B reviews for these different SaaS applications. And not only that, but I think there's maybe this misnotion that oh, well, if you're in B2B, everything is serious and, dull and sterile brands. But in my experience, people love to connect with brands on the B2B side just as much as they do on the B2C side. And I think we all have, from our personal lives, experiences where we have that brand that we just love. There's almost an emotional connection to it. We love the service or the product. We tell other people about it. We love interacting with that brand. And I think there's the same opportunity on the B2B side. And I think that's another shift I've been seeing in kind of the buyer's journey, where people, for brands that they really have an emotional connection with, you see these step function side effects where they just recommend you more, they buy faster, they buy more, they stay with you longer. And I think that part of the buying process has changed as well.
What do you think has driven that? Is that from a buyer's side in terms of expressing a demand for more, I guess, B2B brands with more of a personality? Or is it been that, the brands that have succeeded have happened to be the ones who've had that personality and that's thus kind of driven that trend?
I think it comes from just consumers. At the end of the day, a lot of people are selling to the CIO or the VP of marketing or the director of finance, but all those roles are people too. and a lot of them go to Amazon and see reviews for the products they're going to buy. And in the same way, they're like, hey, why can't I see reviews for B2B software applications that I'm buying, right? Or they see brands that make them laugh or smile in the consumer space. And maybe they say it the same way, like, hey, I like that when I'm dealing with a B2B brand too. I realize it's kind of a hot topic and a lot of this is very controversial. A lot of people, when you talk to it, B2B brand, no, we have to be, put in our suits and ties and all of our pictures are stock photos of people around a conference table. But in my experience, I think that, businesses of all segments, SMB, mid-market, enterprise, at the end of the day, they're just people, right? And people, when they emotionally connect to a brand, they're much more likely to do business with them. So who knows if that's a chicken and the egg, right? Where some of the most successful companies that just invested in brand, that's why they become big, or was it just kind of a side effect? But I think it's an easy differentiator for companies to stand out in a marketplace, especially when you're creating a category and you want to really develop a deep affinity with your end users.
Yeah. Now, I know at Zendesk, branding and getting that personality right was really important for you. And I think if I've got these right, you defined the brand values there as, I think it was airy, humble, charming, and uncomplicated. Were those values you came up with yourself, and how did those play into your own competitive position?
I think, all the things that I did, that was a, cross collaboration with, people on my team, people on cross-functional teams within the organization. But I think for us at Zendesk, you have to remember, support is just hard. It sucks, right? Like, I've ran support teams. You have people that call in and yell at you for 10 hours a day that have these problems. And most of the support solutions out there, before Zendesk, were incredibly complicated. You needed a month of training. You would get sent an instruction manual that was like a massive dictionary phone book, and it wasn't easy. And here along comes this concept of Zendesk, of just enabling Zen, loving your help desk, simplicity, not complicated. And so I think a lot of, from just that overall theme, we tried to embrace that, not having it be very complicated. So uncomplicated, airy, fun, humble, charming. It just was a very different thesis than a lot of the traditional providers, especially back in the day. A lot of on-prem providers that were just selling straight into the CIO, who never actually used the product and would just kind of give it to the users, and the users were frustrated. And so for us, I think that was just a great opportunity to differentiate. And we use those values both from editorial tone and voice, but also, just from a visual brand identity standpoint. Zendesk, when you think about it, even in the early days, I mean, here you have this giant, green, this Buddha kind of indicating Zen. It was very different, right? It was very distinctive and a lot different than what some of the other traditional players were using at that point.
Right. Do you consider Zendesk to be a category creator, or were you simply playing in an existing category and that was more of a differentiation strategy?
I think, at the time, Zendesk customer service, that's been around a long time, right? And these are always these debates with category creation. I think everyone wants to believe they are creating a new category. But, in the same way, too, I kind of do feel for the analysts for Gartner and Forrester. There can't be literally 20,000 different categories. At some point, they need to kind of combine the players together. I'd say Zendesk, I think where we kind of embraced on a new category was this idea of just simple, easy to use, friendly, for anyone the team could come in and buy it. And, in the customer service space at that time, that was pretty radically different.
So it was less about a new category of software, but maybe more around a philosophy about the business and approach to offering software and working with customers, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. I know we're talking a little bit about like Salesforce and maybe Slack and how we perceive them to be maybe different category creators with different business models, or even how we took that. But I think for Zendesk, it was a lot about the interactions, the experience that you were having, and in a different go-to-market model. And I think that really helped us be able to differentiate. Also, even just this idea of on the go-to-market model, starting off with SMB and then slowly moving the company up to mid-market and enterprise. For a lot of companies that just skip that step and just go straight to enterprise, at least I've seen some of the companies I talk to or even advise, if they go straight to enterprise, they kind of miss that step that says, we got to make a really easy to use product that people can maybe buy frictionless, that, they're going to have an emotional connection with. And sometimes when you just go straight to enterprise, you lose a lot of that. You lose a lot of that brand essence. And so I think there's a balance there. But for us, I thought that was really successful. Being forced to start off with small businesses and then moving more up market allowed us to really, we had to be good. We had to have a brand that people liked. We had to have a brand that people could start using and getting used to it quickly, and didn't need a ton of support or customer success just to get them going.
So you mentioned Salesforce, so that might be a good segue to shift gears there. And I know in that scenario, obviously you weren't selling to SMBs. The company was displacing on-prem software and delivering it over the cloud. Now, when you joined, Bill, I think the company was about 9 years old. So what did the competitive space look like at the time, and what were you doing to help continue Salesforce's kind of unique position out there?
Yeah, when I joined, so that was kind of my first B2B business that I joined after kind of my consumer run. And it was really interesting because when I joined, maybe the company was about 3,000 people. I kind of came in and to be honest, I saw a lot of maybe older school B2B marketing tactics being embraced. And I think part of the reason they brought me in was they wanted to infuse a little B2C DNA, maybe innovate on the go-to-market model, focus more on the digital marketing side. And so really what I tried to do is just bring us up to, best in breed and really innovate on what could happen in a B2B setting. So I invested a lot of resources, just on the marketing tech stack, making sure we had the right multi-touch attribution modeling, investing a lot in content marketing, lead scoring, nurturing, doing a lot of multivariate testing, heat map analysis, but then also just building a really massive lead generation engine. Salesforce, we were constantly hiring and expanding the sales team, and it was just more and more mouths to feed, right? And so I was really proud of what we did. We created just an amazing tech stack that allowed us to scale. We did really early ABM marketing before that was kind of like a big fad or a big strategy. So we were targeting companies individually, saturating them, educating them, delivering content at the right stage. And so then when our salespeople went in, it wasn't as, I've never heard of Salesforce before. It was, oh yeah, I heard about you. I read this, or, I've seen you guys a lot in different places, and it really softened them. And that allowed us to accelerate deal cycles, get larger deals that would close faster. And it was just it was a fun time. I loved, I guess one of the things that always frustrated me was that when you would come into a company and I would see all these amazing SaaS products coming out, and then I'd kind of ask a little bit more like, well, what's your go-to-market model? And it was just like a 30-year-old dusty B2B playbook. And I just thought, we should be innovating as much on the go-to-market side as we are at the product level. Whether that's, high velocity, bottoms up, freemium models, content marketing, SEO, ABM. I mean, there's just, the fun thing about marketing is it's always changing and iterating and becoming more innovative. But I wanted to embrace some of those and bring those into Salesforce. And so over the 4 years, that's what we did.
Now, I heard you mention in another interview that Mark Benioff was constantly kind of repositioning the company or rethinking the position. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So first off, Mark is just, boy, what an incredible person. just a philanthropist, humanitarian. He's donated so much to these incredible causes, just a great person, but also just this incredibly savvy business person as well. And I think what Mark was really good at was he just had a pulse on how to elevate Salesforce and really have it be about a mission, and even in the early days, Mark wouldn't go out and really what we were doing is we were selling sales automation software, right? You could go out and go, hey guys, like check out this cool forecasting feature we have, or here's how you can calculate quota attainments. But what he did is he really built a mission around no software and just this idea of the SaaS model, the cloud model, which thankfully, he invested in that because there's literally 1,000 SaaS companies now that can really thank him for kind of building this model. And at the time, people were really nervous about it. I mean, it's like, what? You want us to take our most valuable customer data from our own servers and put it into the quote unquote cloud and ethos, and it's going to be surrounded with all these other customers' data? Is like, what? Are you crazy? So I think as part of that, he was just constantly thinking about how we can fine tune into the positioning, our messaging. We did a lot of events, and Mark used that actually as a way to kind of test out different messaging. When I came in, we put in a lot of the framework where we could test that messaging on the site itself. And there was one funny story we had where Mark, pretty much every year, we would kind of evolve and iterate and innovate on the messaging. And it was very early, I don't know what it was, maybe 8 years ago. And he really kind of understood this shift to social. And we were seeing how it was disrupting all these different areas, right? In the Arab Spring Rising, and we were launching this product, Chatter, and so he really believed in the social enterprise. And Chatter was kind of Salesforce's messaging product at the time, and so we were all about the social enterprise, right? And we're going on our conferences, we're doing this, and so of course all that messaging has to be everywhere. So it kind of comes down. It's like, hey, we need to get this on the homepage. And we put it on the homepage, the social, Salesforce, the social enterprise. And all of a sudden, we start to notice our leads are dropping a little bit, and we're monitoring our bounce rate on our homepage, and that's going up. And we're like, what's going on here, right? And so we did this 5secondtest.com. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. It's a super cool site. You can just go, I think it's 5 seconds, 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 5secondtest.com.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, 5secondtest.com. So what they'll do is, the idea is they will put up a homepage, and they'll have a panel that's representative of your buyers. They'll show you the homepage for literally 5 seconds, and then it goes black. And then they go, hey, what does this business do? What are they selling? What's their value prop? And the idea is hey, people in general, you scan, you don't spend 30 minutes on a homepage, right? And so we did this, and we started to get the results back. And a lot of people thought Salesforce Social Enterprise was, we sold software for nonprofits. That's
really?
what we did, right? Because they saw the social enterprise, right? And so that was interesting, right? And I thought it was a really good use case of some of the more digital online marketing tools that were coming out that allowed us to make, informed data-driven decisions based on what we were seeing for drops, right? And who knows? Because we've all had that as marketers. You see a drop in your leads, and it's like, oh wait, well, was it seasonality, or this competitor launched this, or a pricing change? And sometimes it's a little bit tough to tease out what happened. But I thought that was kind of a fun one as we were always evolving our messaging and positioning.
Yeah, I'll have to go back into the Wayback Machine and see if I can find the archive of that.
It's there somewhere.
Well, a moment ago, you mentioned the mission and this kind of vision for the world that Mark was trying to sell people on, which was this idea of getting rid of on-prem software and all the headaches and costs associated with that, and moving towards a model that was more flexible and easier to use and just really better for everyone. And I think it's really interesting when I look at category defining companies, take something like HubSpot, for example. They have a very strong mission about making the process of marketing better for buyers and sellers alike, and inbound is all about that. So as you were going through these different iterations of positioning, were you always coming back and referencing that core mission and that core story that you and Mark had developed early on?
Yeah, certainly. I think this is one where Mark loves the messaging and positioning side. He was always very close to it. We were always working closely with him on it. And, the same thing, he had a core set of values around how he saw the enterprise software space changing and Salesforce's role in that. Where I thought whether he was really good is he would also just take kind of the topical news of the day and really try to align Salesforce to that and how we could reposition our mission so that we were in the news a lot and we got incredible coverage. And I think that that's a fine balancing act to, what is current, what are the larger macro themes that are happening, but also how does that relate to your core mission and how can you intersect those so you do get the coverage, so you do get people talking about you and you get the overall brand lift.
Yeah. Well, when you're in an advisory role now for multiple different companies, when you're assessing, the strengths and the potential of these companies, to what extent do you look at mission? Do you look at story and, a company's ability to kind of tell or paint a picture of the future that's bigger than just, a set of features and, specifications?
Yeah, great question. For me, to me, that's what I look at with companies that I advise now is I look at and just go, hey, is there a lot of pain in your space? Maybe even latent pain. I often think with Uber, for example, there was a lot of latent pain in that space. I remember I'm old enough that I remember taking taxis to the airport, and I remember I would call, Yellow Cab or something. They would be busy. I call Luxor. I finally get someone like, hey, I need to go to the airport. Can you tell me what time they're going to be here? No, we can't. I'm nervous. They're not going to arrive in time. Do I have to go to a backup? And then they finally do come. But now I'm like, I don't know if they take credit cards. What route are they taking? And I had a lot of lane pain. But at the time, if you asked me like, hey, what is the pain in your life? I don't know if I would have said, oh, taking the taxi to the airport, right? That's terrible. So I always look for just, is there, pain or lane pain in this space? And I think at the end of the day, if you have a lot of pain in that space and you're coming in and you're willing to disrupt it, you can create a category around that and you can be a category defining company. So that's a big area that I look at. I also look at, I just have a fundamental belief around this idea of customer centricity. And Mark was a huge advocate for it at Salesforce. He always talked about, the success of our customers and making them successful. And I just know like when I was a CMO for a while, I bought a lot of software, but it was a pretty crappy buying experience, right? Because I remember I would try to find, I heard about this company. Okay, I go to their website. Sure, here's a demo video, but it's like, nope, you can't watch it. You got to fill out this giant form first. And then, okay, all right, I fill out the form and I'm literally called in the next hour and I'm like, I'm not ready to talk. I'm just learning a little bit about the space, right? And then, as I go through the sales process, I literally have 10 people selling me, they're buying me steak dinners and doing this wonderful stuff. And the minute I sign the deal, I am assigned like 1/1000th of a customer success person to make me successful. And I'm like, well, that's a little odd, the ratios, right? And then if I did need support, it was 5 pages deep and it was a tiny 4 font customer support link and it would take 3 weeks to get a response from it. And I'm just like, man, go to market and someone buying something. It's set up to just be a really bad buying experience. And can we innovate on that? So I really love working with founders today that are open to different ways of going to market and taking a more customer-centric approach. And those are the founders that I love working with.
And I think you've certainly done that in your time at Slack. I think I've heard you mention elsewhere that, the messaging for the company wasn't just like siloed from marketing and product. So in other words, you had a specific tone of voice and this kind of helpful attitude that you wanted to convey on the marketing side. But then once people got into the product and they started using it, they found that voice was consistent and, there were the helpful and kind of fun product update, notes and other things of that nature. So I'd love to hear more about kind of how you kind of implemented that and what was the impetus for that in Slack, because I feel like that, among other things, was a huge differentiator in the inter-office communications space.
Yeah, definitely. So, when I had moved from Zendesk over to Slack, again, I saw a space that just a ton of pain. I didn't know anyone that really loved email, nor kind of the other collaboration tools that were out at the place. There was just a lot of frustration around it. I thought we had an opportunity and I was excited to join because Stuart and the board really believed in this customer-centric approach and creating an iconic brand that was different, that was relatable and fun and whimsical. And we had core values at Slack around things like courtesy and empathy. And I had never seen another B2B company that had those, right? Usually it was all war terms, like we're going to dominate or destroy the market. And here's this like, no, like we want to hire people that are, humble and have a lot of empathy and can put ourselves in our customer's shoes and have a lot of courtesy. And so what we really tried to do was, that works great when you're a small team. And I joined really early. I was the first marketer. And my role eventually grew to where I ran the marketing, sales, success, and support. And that was great because it was all the customer facing teams. And it allowed us then to think about, hey, as we grow and scale, how do we make sure that those core values come out, right? And so we did a lot of things like codifying those core values. We had them everywhere, had them on the walls. We had them as like interview questions to kind of tease out, is someone customer centric? Do they have the right empathy? And then we would codify them into like our editorial tone and voice and document it and train people that were writing anything, right? Whether that was for marketing, whether that was for support, or it was for sales. We would actually teach them the tone and voice and then even like test them on it, right? Just kind of think like, hey, same thing with sales enablement, right? But more from an editorial tone and voice perspective. And also, I think just, I was always really passionate that the brand is not just your experience with the product. It's every single touch point. And again, when you go through B2B buying, a lot of those touch points are with these go-to-market teams. So sales, support, success, marketing, you're actually having more interactions with them, at least initially, than maybe you are with the product itself. And so we really wanted to have just a cohesive, fun, friendly brand. We didn't use acronyms. We tried to just put a smile on your face, and we tried to put that with all the customer-facing teams and into the product itself, through the release notes, through the welcome message of the day, through the visual identity. The Slack had a very distinct brand, the colors we use, kind of our logo. And it was really all those to just always our North Star was around this overall experience that someone was having.
Yeah, I think that's at least one of the reasons why Slack took off so quickly, in that I know a lot of your model was based on someone in the team kind of being an early adopter, kind of sharing with a few other people, and it just being very lightweight and delightful to use. And that would not have happened if you hadn't really been intentional about making that messaging right and implementing that across the board. I'm curious if someone is listening and they're thinking about an initiative maybe like that, or something that's more brand related, maybe something that kind of pushes the boundaries a little bit in the B2B space, but they have all that idea internally. What's your advice to succeed in that?
So I would just say I think a lot of times when I work with companies or advise them, there's sometimes a misplaced belief that like, oh, well, in order for us to get big or different, we have to spend a ton of money. And actually, like, I don't think you need to. This is one of those areas, again, when I graduated from college and co-founded my first startup, we didn't have any money. We were bootstrapping it. So I think like for you to codify a really unique editorial tone and voice, a visual identity, core values around customer centricity, those are all things that, you're not spending $1 million to do. That's just more kind of an ethos, a core set of values that you're aligning around. And again, like I like the zag when everybody's zigging. Yeah. So, if you look at most B2B spaces or verticals, oh my God, and I don't mean this to come off the wrong way, but it's, so many of these products, when you actually dive into the product itself, it's black and white. It is, sterile, lifeless. Every button is, okay, accept, next. There's just no emotion. There's nothing to connect with. And I mean, I understand it too, because a lot of times that's, dev and programmers that are writing this up. But I think sometimes there's this misplaced belief in B2B space that, marketing, well, you're just there to get leads, right? And then you hand them off, and sales is there to close them, and then they go to the product, and that's just product. So I think if you can take it from a more holistic standpoint and go, hey, if I'm on the marketing team, I have to think about that entire journey, and thinking about the visual identity throughout the entire journey, the editorial tone and voice throughout the entire journey, just the experience touch points that we're having. It's like we did things like we just religiously, measured and monitored Net Promoter Score. We did a lot of transactional CSAT surveys. We were always just trying to understand from an experience standpoint, where are we providing great experiences? Where are we providing friction? And ultimately, I would tell all my teams that, hey, your goal isn't to get someone just to buy from us. Your goal is to get them to recommend us. And I just thought that was a higher bar and a harder bar. And we really had to think about not just, okay, did we get them to like sign up or pay us money, but hey, do they love us to the point that they're going to go and recommend us to 20 other people? And that's where, in combination with sophisticated marketing tech stack and scaling, like you're going to get like that crazy hyper growth. And that's what I think allows you to ultimately have these category killers.
So you mentioned ethos, you mentioned messaging, you mentioned an understanding of visual identity. What other skills do you think are critical for marketers at companies that are developing new categories or aspire to develop a new category?
I think marketing is always fun and challenging because you have this wide spectrum of kind of the qualitative brand design side to this quantitative data side, right? I've talked a lot about like more the brand, the visual identity, the tone of voice, but I think there's a huge part which is just on this data-driven marketing, understanding multi-touch attribution modeling, right? I think for a long time in B2B marketing, it was just either first touch or last touch. You're letting that model determine where all the money goes. And one of the things that I found out, spending a lot of time on this in Salesforce and Zendesk and Slack is like people don't just see your brand once and click and buy in it. It can be 20, 30 touches over 3 to 6 months before they even become a lead. And then there's like another long period before they buy. And, you have to be able to model that out or work with the right software. I think you have to understand and invest in just the marketing tech stack. You can't just throw bodies at problems, right? If you're going to grow and scale, you have to understand, predictive lead scoring and multivariate testing and nurturing and content marketing and social media analysis and even measuring brand, right? Like that's kind of a fluffy thing for a lot of, people, but really, for instance, at Slack, we would measure, aided recall, unaided recall, a share of voice, sentiment, share of conversation to really understand how we were progressing there. And when we did launch these larger campaigns, how much did it cost us to get a point lift in awareness? I think you have to have the right blend there, and that's where it can be sometimes challenging because I think people naturally fall into one or the other. But overall, as a marketing team, I think you have to have the right rounded skill sets to have a comprehensive strategy to address those issues.
So you mentioned brand recall. That sounds like a skill that you may have brought over from your B2C days.
Yeah, it's funny because I think in B2B for a long time it was really, really expensive to kind of measure brand awareness, and literally they would send people to the airport and find decision makers and get them to fill out a survey, and it cost you $100,000 every time you want to run a simple survey. And now it's really not that bad. You can use a SurveyMonkey or any of the different email tools out there. You can predefine your target demographics, the population, and then you can ask them the classic aided and unaided awareness questions. And for those that don't know it, it's pretty simple. It's just simply like, hey, for instance, when you think of team communication software, which brands come to mind? That's unaided, right? You don't give them any hints. And aided is, okay, when you think of team communication software, which of the following are you aware of, right? So like Slack, HipChats, Yammer, ... right? And then sentiment just asks them, favorability, extremely favorable to unfavorable for each of those brands. So I think the fun thing is when you start measuring those, you not only get your own, but you get all your competitors too. And so you can start to understand, all right, well, what is the awareness for these other areas? And then, of course, people always overestimate their awareness. I remember when we first started doing it at Slack, it was literally one of the first things I did when I got hired on was, well, I want a good baseline, right? And of course, at that time, and this was a while back, but everybody in the company thought, oh yeah, everybody knows us. And definitely, because I'd see people on the street and they know Slack. But the minute I would fly anywhere outside of this little bubble of Silicon Valley, and I would fly to the East Coast and be talking to some like government people in a CIO forum, and no one would know Slack. So I think just again, like doing the data allows you to take out this kind of hippo highest paid opinion and kind of get just down to the data driven facts, and it allows you to make educated decisions when you run campaigns and you do these different customer centric strategies to understand the impact on your brand lift, the impact on your net promoter score, and just make a more educated decision moving forward.
Now, a tactic or an approach I haven't heard you mention today is PR, but I've heard you mention elsewhere that at Slack, Stuart Butterfield's story was exceptional and he was a great speaker, and PR was something that you guys invested in rather intentionally. Yep. How should B2B marketers assess whether PR is worth pursuing or not?
Yeah. So, at Slack, as much as I say I love all these customer-centric strategies, we did a lot of content marketing, PR. We did a lot of outbound advertising campaigns. We had our own podcast. We did a lot of traditional tactics. And you need those to augment just your word of mouth, right? Like you need both to get you to that hyper growth level. PR is one of those things, though, that I think you really have to look at a case by case basis. And I mean, the reality is, if you go to TechCrunch or Mashable or a lot of the tech pubs out there, 95% of the coverage is going to be around 5 companies. It's going to be around like Apple and Microsoft and Google. Every once in a while Slack will get in there, but it's the big ones, right? And then you have 20,000 other tech companies that are scrapping for the remaining articles. So I think going in, you have to be really deliberate. PR is one of those feast or famine type things. You're going to get a ton or you're going to get nothing. And that's why I think a lot of people get unhappy with their PR agencies, and maybe unfairly they blame the PR agency, when in reality, you kind of have to understand, like, hey, is my company really that special, right? Or do I have a spokesperson that's that special? It was great. Stuart did not mind investing the time into the reporter relationships. He had a crazy backstory of like growing up in Canada in the backwoods and forming 2 gaming companies that eventually pivoted into, totally different types of companies. And he was willing to take the time to do that. Whereas I think sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with this, I'll work with a founder who, is an incredibly brilliant developer roots, but is more of an introvert, doesn't like to talk to other people, and, doesn't have a really crazy backstory. And I'm like, hey, don't invest in PR. Don't spend that 10 or 20K monthly retainer. We can use that in other places. So I think you have to be realistic. And probably the number one determinant of how much PR coverage you're going to get is your CEO. It's not your agency. So you just have to look yourself honestly and go, hey, do I have a really unique story? Am I charismatic? Am I an extrovert? Am I willing to put the time into building these reporter relationships? And if you are, then maybe you have a chance of getting good PR. But in general, it's a really tough space to get a lot of PR for just an average company.
I think that's great advice. PR is one of those things that it kind of feels good to get your company mentioned in certain publications, and the attention always makes you feel kind of proud of yourself. But I think you make a good point. If the story really isn't there, and if it's not something natural, and you don't really have something special to say, then maybe it's worth reconsidering pursuing that or not.
Yeah, and and it's also, and again, I have nothing against PR. We've used it really well at Salesforce and Slack, but it is one of those 20-year-old, 30-year-old traditional B2B tactics. And I just think like, hey, it may still work, and there's definitely a place for it, but that should be, I think you should look at it at a holistic level and think about like, hey, how are we innovating in these different core areas? What are we doing for content marketing? What are we doing for predictive lead scoring? What are we doing for ABM? And just every year something new comes out in marketing, like the technology advances, or there's different ways to measure different things, and allows you to embrace new tactics. So I always advocate when I work with different founders of, hey, just as incredible as an innovative as your product is, like let's make your go-to-market model that, and let's make it a differentiator, and let's allow you to grow and scale faster and define a category and dominate it. And I think if you take that same mentality and approach it to all your different marketing areas, you're really going to be able to move the needle.
So Bill, as with your perspective as an advisor now, and being able to kind of look at the whole B2B space from kind of the 50,000 foot view, what are some examples of category defining companies you really admire right now?
Sure. Well, there's one that's been a North Star for me for a long time is Amazon, and Jeff Bezos. Not only that, because I think 1% of the revenue comes from my household, the amount of stuff that me and my wife seem to order and the amount of packages that show up. But also just, I think, Jeff is a classic example of just, insanely customer centric. And you hear these amazing stories that come out of the company. I love one that's around, for every meeting, they'll leave an empty chair, and that chair is the customer. And, at the end of the meeting, you go, hey, would the customer have liked whatever our decision was? Because ultimately, as the company grows and scales, a lot of times you just kind of focus on more on internal mechanics, and you don't really think about what is the impact on the customer. I remember this was, kind of an example of that when Apple launched their own maps, which came out to, a lot of interesting, their launch strategy. But one of the things they did was, Apple inherently defaulted everything to the Apple Maps. And I love Google Maps, I just have used it for so long, and I love the product. And it was really frustrating to me. Like that was a great example of, that wasn't a customer-centric decision. That was something that I'm sure was internally debated and said, hey, we need to build up our own. And it doesn't matter if it's a bad experience or if Apple Maps isn't that good to start with. We're just going to, force everyone to essentially use it. And those have impact, right? And it was even something going on a little bit of a tangent, but even think about Slack when we came out, one of the things we were always really deliberate about was any type of biz dev or integration thing. We always want to think about the customer at the end of it. So Slack, over time, we launched our own video conferencing and audio conferencing and screen share, but we still, you could use anyone you wanted. You could use Zoom. You could use any of the dozens of video conferencing. We made it really easy. And I just think like that idea of customer centricity, a lot of that, for me, I was always inspired by Amazon. And I think you're seeing more and more companies now that are really trying to look beyond just these short-term metrics of, how many leads did we get or what was the sales that we closed, to think more long-term of like, hey, well, these people got to think about lifetime value, and SaaS naturally makes you think about that. But even going beyond that, well, what if this one person recommended us to 50 other people? Like maybe that lifetime value should be a little higher. Maybe we should think about the experience and getting them to recommend us, or even having a brand that differentiates and that they love. So I'm always inspired by other customer-centric companies out there. And I give kudos to all the founders that kind of have the courage to go down that path.
So why do you think we're not better at that in the B2B space, Bill? Do you think we don't have the skills, or other people we have to report to don't care about it, or it's not valued or measured? What's holding us back?
Yeah, if you talk to most CEOs, I think everyone will go, yeah, we're about the customer, right? I haven't met many CEOs that don't say they're not about the customer. I mean, to be honest, I think what happens is in Silicon Valley, it really starts with the VCs, and you have so many companies that are being founded, and there is such a obsession with kind of short-term metrics that all the focus is put on these short-term metrics. How many leads did we get in? How much ARR did we close? And I think it's a little bit harder to go and say, hey, you know what? As opposed to kind of the short-term metric, let's look a little bit further out. Let's look at more, for instance, Net Promoter Score is more of a leading indicator of how much people love us. And another thing Jeff said at Amazon, which I always believed in too, is he said, hey, for any company, there's inputs and outputs. Like outputs are your revenue, how fast you're growing. But when Jeff would go into the year, he wouldn't say, well, our target for revenue is this amount this year, or we want to sell this much product. He would go, hey, let's focus on the inputs. And the inputs for Amazon were lower prices and faster shipping times, and better product depth and breadth. And those were the inputs to get you those great outputs. And in the same way, I think for companies that kind of recognize that, hey, giving a great experience and measuring things like transactional CSAT and Net Promoter Score, and think about that experience, like gives you the output of faster growth. And so, ultimately, I think it's a combination of all those things. It's insanely competitive. There's so many startups out there. A lot in the VC space put more weight on kind of your short-term metrics, and that forces the CEO and the operating team to look at those metrics. And, it's tough. It's tough. Like you need that next round of financing. You're going to, be more weighted around there. But I really believe when you have this combination of a board that believes in long-term customer centricity, an operating team, and you hire people, kind of even at like Slack, right? We hire people that are around, customer centricity, that had empathy, that had courtesy. Like you get more this holistic customer centricity company, and that allows you just to get these crazy word of mouth referrals, and you get that incredible growth rate.
That's interesting. You mentioned Amazon as that example of shareholder expectations, because if I recall correctly, Jeff pretty early on set expectations around the company being a long-term play, and they might need to be prepared to lose money for several years as they kind of built that. So, obviously not all of us are in that position to directly influence our investors and our board, but I think that's great advice. Whether you're starting a company looking for funding, or if you're looking to join a company, it's not just about the product, but it's about the people who are providing the backing for the company and the way they view things.
And that's one of the things that when I work with companies now in the advisory capacity, and the other thing I try to help them out with is like, hey, let me connect you to VCs that believe in customer centricity, that have a longer term outlook. Because there are great ones out there that do believe in that. And I think at the end of the day, most operators, they're not satisfied with just making a tiny company. They've got a great vision, and most founders have a long-term outlook. So if you can get kind of all the different pieces in place, I think you're in much better position to embark on a strategy like that.
Good stuff. Well, Bill, we've spoken at length, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface, but we're getting close to the end of our time. So I just want to ask you one question that I like to ask all the experts that I meet with. If one of our listeners is interested in exploring more about category design, B2B branding, what are some resources that you recommend?
Yeah. So obviously you have this incredible podcast. And I think it's always great to go through the archives there. Personally, I love podcasts. I found myself just on the road a lot and in traffic a lot. And so podcasts for me were a great opportunity to learn a lot about different spaces, different opportunities. So I like there's some great podcasts out there that I always like to stay on top of. Things like Marketing Over Coffee. If I'm thinking of my marketing skills, if I'm thinking of my manager skills, I like Manager Tools. I think that's a great one out there. Economist. I think ultimately we can talk about category creation in a very 10,000 foot level, but really what it comes down to is execution, right? Like it's all these little blocking and tackling areas of building a customer centric company, building the right marketing tech stack, having the right demand gen funnel, building that editorial tone and voice. And so I think anywhere that you can find either podcasts, conferences, people that are passionate about, building best of breed specs in those areas, that's what's going to allow you to grow and expand and hopefully, create and dominate your own category.
Good deal. Bill, if one of our listeners wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, just contact me on LinkedIn. Shoot me a note. Happy to talk, and always enjoy conversing with other passionate people around the space.
Yeah, I can vouch for that, Bill, because you're one of those people who's accomplished so much. But I think I sent you one LinkedIn message, and you responded. I think within 30 minutes. Made my day.
Good deal. No, I mean we're all in this together. I mean, it's one of the reasons I enjoy advising companies now. Is it's an opportunity for me to just kind of reach out and talk to other people that are also passionate about building their own categories and kind of sharing them both the wins as well as the heartaches of what I've gone through. So I love working with other people that are passionate that maybe want to do it differently in a customer centric way. And like I said, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to talk and go from there.
All right. Well, Bill, thanks so much for being with us today. It was great having you.
John, it was such a pleasure, man. I really enjoyed the topics. I think we could have gone on for a couple hours on these, but I know most people don't have that long of a commute. So hopefully this filled up their commute quite nicely.
Sure thing. Okay, well, that's it for this category creation episode of the B2B Growth Show. I'm John Rougeux, and if you have any thoughts you want to share about category creation, I would love to hear from you. You can find me by just typing john.marketing in your browser. That's john.marketing. And you can find all of my contact info there. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Digital marketing agencies have a tough job. You have to stay on top of the latest marketing strategies for your clients and your agency. What if there was a way you could address both at the same time? Imagine your agency putting out content with greater quality and quantity. Envision bringing your clients a turnkey solution for one of B2B marketing's fastest growing media strategies, podcasting. All those clients asking for your help with their account-based marketing efforts? Picture being the first to bring them the idea of content-based networking, showing them the proven strategy for breaking into their most coveted accounts. Here's the concept. Sweetfish Media is looking to work with a limited number of innovative agencies interested in a new partnership model. We produce a podcast for your agency. You introduce the power of podcasting and Sweetfish services to your clients. Everybody wins. Learn more at sweetfishpartners.com.